My mother is demanding that I end my wife's pregnancy because my sister can't have children, but now the only thing being ended are her chances of being a grandmother. My sister and I are 3 years apart, but our mother has always treated her as if she were a little, spoiled girl. I suppose that's why she's become so self-centered even now, at her current age of 27. I'm 30, and my wife and I are expecting our first child. We've been married for 2 years and together for 5, and we're thrilled about becoming parents. We found out about the pregnancy a few months ago and decided to tell our families before making a public announcement. My wife's family was overjoyed for us, but, of course, my mother had to find something negative about it. My father congratulated us and left it at that, but a few hours after we shared the news, my mother called to say she didn't think going through with the pregnancy was a good idea. I was shocked because my mother adores children and has always been enthusiastic about becoming a grandmother, both at my wedding and my sister's. Her reaction was entirely unexpected. When I asked her why she'd say something like that, she started giving arbitrary reasons for us not to have a baby right now. She said it would be a financial strain and even mentioned that since we're both career-oriented, it would be complicated to decide who would stay home with the baby when we had to return to work. I told her we'd already considered these things and had saved enough to support a child, as we've both worked for a long time. It's not like we're just winging it. My wife and I work at the same company, and we both have paid maternity and paternity leave. Also, we'd already thought about hiring a nanny or asking family for help once we went back to work. None of her reasons seemed valid enough to end a pregnancy, and I knew she was holding something back. I kept pressing until she finally revealed the real reason. And of course, it was all about my sister. Apparently, my dear sister had been planning to get pregnant this year as well, but unfortunately for her, she hadn't succeeded yet. She was already quite upset about it, and my mother felt this wasn't the right time for us to have a baby because if we started our pregnancy journey while she was still struggling, it would be emotionally draining for her. The thing is, my sister and I don't get along. We argued a lot when we lived together, and when I went to college and moved out, it was a huge relief for both of us. Since we don't get along, I'm not overly concerned about what she thinks, and that includes my wife's pregnancy. If she can't handle the fact that we're having a baby and she isn't, that's her problem, not mine. But, of course, my mother loves to turn my sister's issues into everyone's business. So I told my mother it was unfortunate that my sister hadn't been able to conceive yet, though she'd apparently been planning it, but that I wasn't going to end my wife's pregnancy just to avoid hurting her feelings. It was an absurd suggestion, and I told her, for her sake, I'd pretend she never said it so I could keep respecting her and move on. But she kept pushing, saying my sister had been trying for a long time and that she and her husband had been unsuccessful. The news of our pregnancy would devastate her, and I needed to be mindful of her feelings and not go through with it, as it would tear the family apart. The most troubling thing about all this was that my mother genuinely thought it was a valid suggestion to end my wife's pregnancy just because my sister would be hurt. I knew there was no point in arguing with her, so I simply said fine and hung up, just to avoid dragging out the conversation. I had no intention of doing what she asked. After that, I blocked her everywhere and even told my father what had happened. He apologized on my mother's behalf and promised to ensure she wouldn't try to contact me again. That's how I handled it, and since then, my father has kept his word and prevented my mother from contacting me. For the past 4 months, we haven't had any communication, and life has been pretty peaceful. Recently, we decided to make a public announcement on social media about the pregnancy because we felt it was finally time to share our joy with everyone. That's how my sister found out. I don't regret making that post because we wanted to celebrate our happiness with everyone, and we did. If it upset my sister, that's too bad for her. And I know it did because a few days ago, she and my mother showed up at my house to talk about our family and how we'd move forward after everything that had happened. To be honest, I never really considered my sister part of my family because she'd never acted like family toward me. As I mentioned, we were never close. Once we stopped living together, there was nothing obligating us to stay in touch, so we didn't involve ourselves in each other's lives. We'd see each other at holiday gatherings, and we even invited each other to our weddings, but it was more out of obligation. I was upfront about this, so I told my sister I didn't see her as close or part of my family, and that's why I didn't think it was necessary to tell her my wife was pregnant. I also knew that if she'd gotten pregnant first, she wouldn't have bothered telling me, and I would have found out on social media when she eventually announced it. As for my mother, I told her that she'd made her bed and now had to lie in it because what she'd said when I shared our pregnancy news was appalling, and I didn't want that kind of negativity in my life. I told them that even if they were there to apologize and make amends, it would take me time to process everything. I wasn't going to forgive them on the spot and give them a second chance. I was brutally honest with them because I didn't have the patience to deal with them right then. After I finished speaking, my sister broke down in tears and started sobbing in the living room. That surprised me a bit because I didn't think she'd be so affected, given that we were never close. I didn't understand why she expected me to be kind and accommodating toward her. My mother consoled her and explained that recently, after planning and trying to get pregnant for almost 1.5 years, my sister had been told she was facing infertility. The doctors couldn't figure out why she wasn't able to conceive, and all she could do was wait. It was heartbreaking for her because, in her mind, she was already ready to be a mother, but physically, it wasn't possible right now. She'd been devastated when she found out a few weeks ago, and then I posted about my wife's pregnancy. That made things even worse for 2 reasons. First, despite trying, she couldn't get pregnant, and here we were celebrating our first pregnancy. Of course, that made her feel bitter and resentful. The second reason was that she had to find out her own brother was going to be a father through social media, realizing just how distant we'd become due to our personal differences. Now, she wanted to try to mend things between us. I softened a bit after hearing that, but I still managed to stand my ground. I told her I appreciated that she'd come all this way to try to patch things up with me, but I still needed time to process everything and decide whether I wanted to give our relationship a chance. I also told her I genuinely felt bad about her infertility and hoped she'd be able to conceive someday. However, at this moment, I couldn't prioritize anyone else's needs because the only thing that mattered to me was my wife and our baby. Everything else could be resolved later. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to deal with my sister and mother at the same time, so I asked them to leave and told them I'd think it over and contact them later. But for now, I felt it was best to keep things as they'd been for the past few years. I thought I was being pretty fair since I genuinely didn't have the capacity to handle both of them, knowing there was so much tension between us. I wasn't in the mood to pretend everything was fine, even if they'd apologized. What my mother had said was dreadful, and my sister had also been distant for years. Rebuilding our relationship would take a lot of effort, and I wasn't willing to invest that energy right now, especially since my wife was pregnant and I wanted to focus on her. I thought this should be obvious, but they both took offense and started calling me selfish, saying I was being narcissistic by refusing to forgive them and pretending I was too busy for them. The truth is, I wanted them to leave quickly because I had to take my wife to a routine checkup and didn't want to be late. So I wasn't pretending to be busy. I was genuinely too busy for them. When they got offended, I was irritated too because I didn't think I'd said anything that would make them act that way. I thought I'd been perfectly reasonable and polite with them. By arguing with me then, they were also delaying my wife's doctor's appointment, so I didn't even want to engage. I just kept asking them to leave and didn't bother denying any of their accusations, though I didn't think I was being selfish. Then they said they just wanted to be part of my child's life, and now, because of my terribly selfish and arrogant behavior, my child would miss out on the love of an aunt and grandmother. My sister told me I wasn't just harming my wife, but also my future children by refusing to forgive them and trying to give our relationship a second chance because of my oversized ego. The suggestion that I was going to do something that wouldn't benefit my child was truly offensive, and that's when I finally lost my cool and responded. First, I told them I genuinely didn't think their involvement in my child's life would make any difference because my baby would be loved regardless. Second, I told them that I didn't believe keeping them out of my child's life was harmful because a few months ago, my mother had literally told me to terminate the pregnancy so that her daughter could have her moment without anyone overshadowing her. As for my sister, she'd been awful to me in the past, and I wasn't about to forgive her now. Given their reaction, I was even more certain I was making the right choice by deciding not to let them be part of my baby's life. If they'd been decent people with any sense, they'd have respected it when I said I wasn't ready to forgive them and needed time to think things through. But instead, They forced their decision on me and began casting me as the villain just because they weren't ready to accept the fact that they might not be involved in my child's life, which, honestly, was their fault. After that, the argument escalated, and my wife had to step in. She'd stayed in our room until then because she didn't have the energy to deal with my mother, sister, and the drama they were causing. I'd asked her to stay out of it because I didn't want her to feel stressed, but everything got so loud and confrontational that she finally had to come out to ask my mother and sister to leave. That upset me a lot because the last thing I wanted was for my wife to be stressed, and that's exactly what they did. I felt terrible for her and extremely angry at my mother and sister. So, I finally decided to respond once and for all, and I think I said something I can't take back, which makes me feel awful. They were shouting at me over my wife's request for them to leave, calling me selfish, telling me I was letting my ego get in the way of a happy family, and that my child would be unfortunate to have a narcissistic father like me. I replied that at least I'd be able to have a child, which is more than I could say for my sister. I pointed out that she was only here because she knew she was infertile and now wanted a relationship with her future niece or nephew, so she could try to fill a parental role, which is just pathetic. And to my mother, I said that the only reason she was here was to feed her daughter's delusions. I told her she was an even bigger failure as a mother than my sister because, despite having 2 kids, she'd failed both of us. This was all her fault. My words had a real impact on them, and they left immediately afterward, but not without hurling a few insults my way. Even my wife was surprised by what I'd said. She told me she didn't necessarily disagree with what I'd said, but that it must have been very painful for them to hear it. Naturally, I feel terrible about saying all that because I'm not the kind of person who enjoys hurting others. But I felt like I had to say something because they were making me out to be the bad guy, and I didn't want them to get away with it. So, am I the bad guy for having responded to my mother and sister by mentioning my sister's infertility and telling my mother she failed as a parent? Update 1. I had that argument with my mother and sister about 3 days ago, and since then, the only people I've discussed it with are my wife and my father. They both have pretty much the same view. What I said was a bit harsh and definitely extreme, but considering the circumstances, it was totally justified. I said it in the heat of the moment, and it's enough that I feel bad about it, but I don't need to apologize. It's not like my mother and sister ever apologized to me for anything they've said. They were the real instigators of the fight. If they'd left when I asked, none of this would have happened. But they chose to stay and argue, pushing me to my limit, and that's why I ended up saying those things. It's a relief that the people I care about most don't think I'm in the wrong for having said those things, even if I feel bad about it. After they left, I don't know if my sister said anything about me, but I do know that my mother has been ranting about me for days. She's been complaining nonstop to my father, and he's been trying to calm her down, but that only makes her angrier, thinking he's enabling my bad behavior. I don't get how she doesn't see that she's been doing exactly the same thing with my sister all along, and that it's probably the reason my sister is the way she is. My mother believes I owe her and my sister a huge apology because they were just trying to be there for me, and that I made them the villains for no reason. It's funny because that's exactly how I feel about them. So, at this point, I guess it's just my word against theirs. Either way, the bottom line is that they're not getting any apology from me because they absolutely deserved what they got. If they hadn't pushed me, I wouldn't have lashed out at them. It's that simple. As I said, my only priority will be my wife, and from now on, I'll try not to let these insignificant things bother me. Update 2. It's been just over a week since I had that fight with my mother and sister. I was trying to keep everything private, only talking to my father and my wife about it, but they apparently had no intention of respecting that. They made things public and posted something about me on their social media, only mentioning the things I'd said, but leaving out all the context. I'm not exaggerating. There was just a paragraph about my comments with nothing about what they said or what led to the argument in the first place. Naturally, after that, I started getting calls and messages from the rest of the family, telling me it wasn't right to say those things to my family and that they'd expected better from me. Many even asked if it was true, as they couldn't believe I was capable of saying those things. I was stunned that they'd gone as far as to post it. Before reaching out to them, I spoke to my father, who said even he was surprised they'd done it. He was trying to talk them into removing the post, but hadn't had any luck so far. At that point, I was furious that they'd done that, so I decided to take action. After talking with my wife, I decided to post the real story of what happened that day. I didn't deny that I'd said what my mother and sister accused me of, but I provided the actual context so that everyone would at least understand. If they were going to seek sympathy from others, I'd make sure people knew the whole truth. I described their visit, what my mother had said about my wife's pregnancy months ago, and what really led to the argument that day. After I posted and people read it, they started commenting in support. Many people reached out to say they'd been quick to judge me and were sorry, and now that they knew the full story, they weren't sure whose side to be on. That's fine by me because I know what I did wasn't nearly as bad as what they did. I didn't even need people to be on my side. If I'd wanted everyone's sympathy, I'd have been the first to post. The only reason I clarified things was to prevent unnecessary hate from coming our way. But I don't think my mother and sister understand that concept. A couple of days have passed since we each posted our side, and they've been accusing me of being an attention seeker, which ironically describes them, not me. They think their actions didn't justify the type of reaction they received from me, and that my comments were outrageous, regardless of the context. But I don't think the rest of the family sees it that way. Anyway, I'm glad I was able to share my side of the story. Update 3. A few days have passed since my last update, and today, when I checked my messages and social media, I noticed that several people had let me know that my mother and sister had deleted their posts about what happened. I guess they started receiving a lot of criticism from the rest of the family, which forced them to take them down. I don't think anyone bought their narrative that I was just seeking attention and sympathy, which is why I'd posted in my defense. Everyone else also agreed that although what I'd said was wrong, it was somewhat justified under the circumstances. They couldn't handle the pressure, so they took down their posts, which felt like a big win for me. I haven't taken down my own post yet because I want to keep it up for a few more days, just in case they try anything funny. Something else interesting happened a couple of days ago. Shortly after I posted my side of the story, my brother-in-law messaged me. Since I'm not close with my sister, I'm not close with her husband either, so we haven't talked much. It was a pleasant surprise when he reached out and told me he knew his wife would never apologize to me. Up until now, he didn't think she had a reason to because he'd only heard her side of the story. But now that he'd read mine, he didn't know what to believe. He asked me to keep this between us, but in case what I'd said was true, he wanted to apologize on her behalf. Ever since learning she'd likely struggle with infertility and that a natural pregnancy without IVF wasn't possible, she'd been quite sensitive. I could tell he was going through a lot from the tone of his message, and I genuinely felt sympathy for him. So I told him it was okay, and that I was grateful he'd at least reached out to apologize. He seems like a genuinely nice guy. I don't know how he ended up with my sister, but I've kept my promise and haven't told anyone about this, except here, but I don't think that breaks the promise. Update 4. A few weeks have passed since my last update, and I recently decided to take down my post. I felt it had been up long enough, and by now, everyone knows the truth. I also thought I didn't need to punish my mother and sister more than they were already punished, as who they are as people is punishment enough. I spoke with my father a few days ago, and he told me that my sister and her husband are in the process of getting divorced. Ever since she found out she had fertility issues, she's been acting completely unhinged. She's always been excessively spoiled, entitled, and, to be honest, a little unbalanced, but lately, she'd become intolerable. Apparently, she'd become very toxic, and her husband had done his best to put up with it. But after a recent argument, he'd had enough, so she moved back in with my parents, and it's been non-stop drama at my father's house since then. I feel bad for my father. Of course, my mother is doing her best to ensure her daughter doesn't feel bad and has been blaming her husband for everything that went wrong, reinforcing the belief that my sister can never be wrong. My heart genuinely aches for my dad, having to deal with all this. I even feel a little sympathy for my sister because she recently found out she can't have children, and now her husband is leaving her. The second part is definitely her fault, but still, I'm not that heartless, so I decided to take down my post. Still, I'm not going to apologize for anything, nor am I going to reach out to them, because I'm pretty sure they haven't changed. My father has even been telling me that there's a lot of, "It should have been me, and not my brother," talk about the pregnancy circulating around their house. So I think it's best to keep our distance from each other. As always, My priority is my wife, and as long as she's happy, I'm happy. So I guess that means I'm very happy right now. Update 5. The first thing I want to share is that I'm now a father, and my wife and I have a beautiful, chubby little boy. Clearly, as a new dad, I'm biased, but it's impossible not to see how perfect he is. We're overjoyed, and honestly, that's all that matters right now. Our families, both my wife's and mine, have been visiting to meet the newest member of the family. Well, almost the whole family, except my mother and sister. As you can imagine, things between us are the same, and I have no intention of changing that. Now that I have my son, my sister, as expected, hasn't shown any interest in her nephew's birth. I'm not surprised at all. In fact, it's a relief because I'd rather not deal with her during this happy stage of my life. From what I've heard, she's been complaining and trying to downplay the baby, but since she's still living at my parents' house, my dad's the only one who has to put up with her negativity. As for us, we haven't been affected in the slightest and genuinely don't care what she says or does. Her absence is more of a blessing than an offense. My mother, on the other hand, seems to have suddenly remembered she's my mom and that she's also a grandmother now. Since the baby was born, she's been urging my dad to mediate between us so that we'll give her a chance to meet her grandson. But fortunately, my dad has remained firm and told her he doesn't want to get involved. He knows our answer very well. She's not going to meet our son. I'm not sure what she expected after everything she's done, especially after suggesting to my wife that she terminate the pregnancy. She said it as casually as if she were suggesting changing restaurants because my sister didn't like seafood. It was ridiculous, heartless, and one of the reasons why our relationship will never recover. As for my sister, I know things aren't going well for her, and honestly, I feel no pity. Her divorce was recently finalized, so you can imagine how miserable she is. My father has already told her she should start looking for a new place to live, and while my mother hasn't taken the suggestion well, he wasn't joking. It seems my father has finally reached his limit after enduring her behavior for so long. Imagine what it must be like for him, tolerating her attitude now that things aren't going her way. So, that's everything. I've tried to keep this brief so I can get back to my son.